As always, I think we are very close, but today might be just a little bit more. Not sure when I might get to do the drop, but that will be hopefully soon, too, after I finish this. Yeah, just gonna try to clean up a little bits here and there and see what needs refining. The buildings are kind of loose. They are on purpose. I don't want too much emphasis on them. Even make it a little further out there. So, worked a lot on these piles yesterday and might do a little bit more, when it looks right, and a little bit of flames here. These are kind of, I'm not sure about what to do with this. Maybe do a little bit on the legs here to check up. Better on the other side, but I'll think about that. It's a lot tighter. Maybe add some curve to it. Anyway, listening to the heroic life and exploits of Siegfried the Dragon Slayer from LibriVox. Put that on. Change my headphones because
the fifth adventure of Siegfried the Dragon we'll see tomorrow, replied Mimer. We shall then try the sixth adventure of Siegfried the Dragon Slayer by Anonymous. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Phil Schempf. How Siegfried brings an aurochs to the smiths. Early the next morning, when the first rays of the sun gleamed upon the sooty faces of the sleeping smiths, Siegfried sprang up from his shield and started off with his dogs to hunt in the forest. He traversed hill and dale until he came on the track of an aurochs. His dogs pursued it eagerly and barked louder and louder as they approached the animal. Siegfried hastened on, and came up just as the aurochs was rushing upon one of the dogs, while the other hound clung fast to its ear. The furious beast lifted one dog upon its horns, and tossed it far behind him amidst the trees, whilst the other dog fell, stunned upon the ground, between the animal's feet. The beast now saw the hero advancing against him. At first he tore up the earth with his forefeet, wild with rage. Then he stood still, measuring the stripling with glaring eyes, and presently dashed with fury at him. Siegfried sprang aside, seized the creature's horns with both his hands, and forced back his fallen head, till the beast reared up and was forced to stand firm and upright, as if life had departed from him. Thus Siegfried led him to the smithy. When he came before the cavern's mouth, he cried aloud, "Wake up! Wake up and receive what I have promised you yesterday." So saying, he thrust the beast into the cave, struck aside the stone, and placed himself in the opening to see what was passing. The smiths leaped from their beds in consternation at the sight of the monstrous beast, and each ran to some place of safety. Some jumped aloft, and held fast on the shields and nails in the wall. Others placed themselves behind an anvil. One sprang upon the forge, and another crept hastily and hid himself in the ashes beneath. The master alone snatched a shield from the wall, and placed himself with a heavy hammer in the centre of the cavern, facing the aurochs. The animal at first stood still, as if in amazement at the strange scene, and looked around. Then he ran furiously at the master, while Siegfried blew a lusty hunting strain on his horn. Before the master could swing his hammer, he was laid prostrate on the ground under his shield. The beast now rushed at those who stood trembling behind the anvil, but they ran right and left, climbing along the wall to the entrance. The aurochs in his fury tossed aside the anvil and stood still before the forge, pawing the ground with his feet, and watching an opportunity to attack the man who stood upon the forge. Then the beast bellowed aloud with fury, and the man shrieked with fear, while Siegfried blew a merry strain as an accompaniment to the dance. The master, having now recovered a little from his fall, stepped behind the beast, and striking its skull with the sharp end of the hammer, it fell dead upon the ground. End of the 6th adventure. The 7th Adventure of Siegfried the Dragon Slayer, by Anonymous. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Phil Schempf. How Siegfried learns to be a smith, and how he was sent by the treacherous Mimer to the dragon. All now hastened up, and Mimer the master said angrily to Siegfried, "Another time, rather take from us than give to us, for the second was worse than the first." "Be not so angry, master smith," answered Siegfried. "I thought the aurochs could better run to thee than I could drag him, and moreover I imagined it would be good sport for thee to give him his death blow. Perhaps I may be able to make thee amends in the smithy, and produce something useful to thee." "If thou dost that, thou shalt have our praise," replied the master. "But we will try at once what thou canst do." Thereupon he seated himself before the forge, took a massy piece of iron, held it in the fire, and gave a weighty hammer that he could scarcely lift into Siegfried's hand. When the iron was red hot, he took it out and laid it on the anvil, and bade Siegfried strike it. At the first blow that Siegfried struck, the stone which supported the anvil split in two, and the anvil sank into the earth. The iron and pincers, too, which Mimer held with both his hands, flew in pieces, and the head of the hammer flew off into a corner of the cavern. Then said Mimer in amazement, but with increased wrath, "Never have I seen such a fearful yet clumsy blow struck. Whoever thou art, it is clear that thou wilt never do for our work." But Siegfried replied, "Did any man ever become a good shot at the first aim? What does not happen today happens tomorrow. Therefore, I pray, be not soured in temper." Then Mimer was silent, for he thought only how he might destroy Siegfried, believing that he was of the race of heroes, a young wolf with sharp teeth, who would bring no good to him and his race. Now Mimer the smith had a comrade whose mind was filled with impiety and vice. Whatever he touched produced poisonous fruit, and to foster this was his sole delight. Therefore the curse had struck him, and he could only crawl about on his hands and knees in the form of a terrible dragon. Then Mimer considered how he could best get rid of the stout young hero, and the idea occurred to his mind of sending him to his comrade for instruction. So he said to Siegfried, "Listen, my bold young friend, you have done nothing as yet in our art. If you wish to learn how to make a good and trusty sword, you must first go to the woods, and begin by charcoal burning." Siegfried was well content, and promised to do as he was desired, for his heart never dreamt of malice or evil. End of the 7th adventure. The 8th Adventure of Siegfried the Dragon Slayer, by Anonymous. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Phil Schempf. How Siegfried fights with the dragon and bathes himself in his blood. Mimer now prepared Siegfried for the journey, and gave him meat and drink for the days that he was to be absent, which the hero secured under his shield. Mimer also gave him an axe, and then showed him the way to the wood, where he intended to accomplish his destruction. When Siegfried had come to the spot which the false master had described to him, he halted. Then he went up to the trees, gave each a blow with the axe which he held in his right hand, and bending them down with his left, he thus felled them. After a while he carried away the trees, and piling them up in a heap, he made a great fire. The sun was now at the meridian, so he had recourse to his stock of provisions, and never left off until he had finished all the supply that Mimer had given him. For his chase through the forest after giants and dragons had given a keen edge to his appetite. After this refreshment he said to himself as he sat on the stump of an old oak tree, "There is now no one so strong as to lift a spear against me, but he would presently lie stretched at his length upon the ground, and never desire to rise again." As he said this, the huge dragon came crawling forth, with a mouth that was wide enough to swallow a man, flesh and bones and all. It had black wings like a bat. Its body was swollen with poison, and resembled a toad, but its long tail was as sharp as a two-edged sword. When Siegfried saw the monster with his sharp white teeth, he was as delighted as if a long-looked-for friend were coming, and he cried, "Now I may have a chance of trying my prowess as I wished." Thereupon he ran to the fire, seized the largest tree, and hastily attacked the fierce creature with the burning brand. He rushed headlong upon him, and forced the flaming point straight into his right eye, so that the beast writhed with the anguish. Then Siegfried struck him on the head with such force that at the first stroke he fell prostrate on the earth, and then he gave him repeated blows until the monster was dead. Siegfried now sat down to rest, and said chuckling to himself, "If the dragons can do no more than this creature here, it is hardly worth the trouble to attack them." He had, however, grown hungry again from his new toil, and he felt as if he had all this time eaten nothing. But it was now growing dark. He had no wish to return to the smithy, and knew not where to procure food. At last he bethought him to roast the heart of the dragon for his supper. So he went at once to work, and thrust his spear down the creature's jaws and body. The trunk of a large tree served for a spit, and on it he hung the dragon with his spear before the fire. But presently the scaly coat began to soften before the fire, and the blood and fat flowed in a stream like melted lead. Siegfried took the flesh of the creature in his hand, but it burned his fingers, and he put them to his mouth to cool them. But when the horn became cold in his mouth, it seemed as if he were biting into steel, it had become so hard. He looked at his fingers, and they were covered with horn, as with gloves of iron. When the young hero beheld this, he felt rejoiced, and quickly throwing off his clothes, he held his helmet under the melting scales till it had grown hard, and then bathed himself in the stream which flowed from the dragon. The horn covered his whole body except the back between the two shoulders, where a leaf of the lime tree had fallen, which the horn could not penetrate. This horn was like a strong coat of armour, which no weapon could penetrate, except between the shoulders where the lime leaf had fallen. And from this horny covering the hero is called Siegfried the Horny to the present day. Then he took up an axe and cut the dragon in pieces. Part he gave to his dogs, and the rest he threw to the birds of prey. The head he put aside. Then he lay down again to take his meal, and the birds of the forest sung their evening song. He cut out the heart of the beast with his sword, and behold, while he was eating, there resounded many voices, as if of men around him. Whereupon he turned, and was about to invite them to his meal, but he saw nothing but trees, and birds which were hopping from bough to bough, and seeking a place of rest. Now he perceived that the voices he heard could come only from the birds. And he remembered that he had once heard an old ballad sung by a foreign minstrel, in which it was said that whoever ate the heart of a dragon should instantly learn the language of the birds, and thus learn many a secret. He therefore desisted from eating, and listened to the voices of the birds. Presently a quail cried out to her sister, "Bilderic! Success! Success! The dragon is conquered and killed! Killed!" As she was crying thus, a chaffinch came flying by. He had not understood the quail clearly, and cried, "What? What? What? The dragon conquered? Victory? Victory? victory! A blackbird whistled. Yes, yes, only think of it. Siegfried has done it. Hail to thee, Siegfried! 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 With him came 3 old ravens, and seated themselves croaking on the bough of a withered oak. The first said to the second, Alas, alas, thou hast again deceived us, sister. Didst thou not say that we should find Siegfried dead? Yes, replied the other. I heard myself this morning how Mimer laughed at Siegfried and said, Go, proud boy, the ravens will soon fly off with thy bones. The dragon will help thee to burn coals. Thus said Mimer, and if Siegfried's arm had not been stronger than his understanding, it would have turned out so. Thereupon the third raven began. I am afraid there will not be much for us here, for Siegfried's dogs leave little behind. However, we must not despair. We shall still be able to pick out his eyes, for he is too confiding and trusts too much in men. Otherwise he would have seen from Mimer's evil eyes that he meant him no good. If Siegfried does not take care, the other will plant his iron in his heart yet. Aye, but if he is wise, replied the first raven, he will cut off Mimer's head in time. That I should be sorry for, said the third, for he has given us many a good feast from dead bodies. But let us fly away before the sun sets, for yonder in the forest I know of a fallen stag. Let us go and enjoy it together. The 2 others accepted the invitation, and they all flew away together with a loud croak. Meantime the little birds had all become silent. Siegfried with his dogs continued his supper in peace. Then he went to a clear stream, where he drank and laid himself down to sleep under an oak, resting according to his custom upon his shield. And when he looked up at the huge trunk of the tree, and saw its wide and leafy branches, and how the winds of evening played around its top, and the stars shone through its boughs, how the birds found rest in its covering, and the animals lay beneath its shelter, and the branches were ranged around its stem, and when he further reflected how many a tempest and storm it had defied, and that it now overshadowed the land like a king, then Siegfried thought how he should like to stand like an oak among men, lending shade and protection to all around, and with this thought he fell asleep. End of the 8th adventure. The 9th adventure of Siegfried the Dragon Slayer, by Anonymous. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Phil Schempf. How Siegfried comes again to the smithy and settles accounts with Mimer. Next morning early, when the birds of the forest, large and small, hailed the young day with their joyous song, Siegfried arose, stuck the head of the dragon on the point of his spear, and went straight back to the smithy. Mimer and his companions heard from afar the barking of dogs, and the rustling of the bushes, and the steps of the hero as he approached. They all came running out before the cave, and Eckhart said to Mimer, "Aye, master, here comes Siegfried, and on his lance he bears the dragon's head. Now he will serve us as he has done the dragon. I shall stay no longer." "What, you cowardly fellows," answered the angry master, "go back immediately into the cave, and put the large hammer in the fire. Then we will place ourselves at the entrance to welcome him, and brand the boy on his fair forehead with the red-hot iron if he makes aught ado." "Nay," replied Eckhart, "I will have nothing more to do with him unless he were to lie asleep before me, so that I could drive a wedge into his head before he awaked. But see, here he comes in great anger. We are 12 in number, it is true, but were we half as many more, nothing could help us but the swiftness of our legs." So saying, Eckhart ran away, the first into the thicket, and all the others after him. Mimer remained alone, cursing and stamping. "I shall manage the boy, however," said he, "for many is the piece of hard iron I have softened." So he went to meet Siegfried, and bade him welcome. Siegfried, however, looked at him sternly, and his anger darted like lightning from his eyes, so that Mimer was fain to look on one side, while the hero thus answered his greeting: "None of you, ye faithless ones, shall be welcome to me. I have burned the coals, and I have paid his recompense to the companion you sent me, and now thou shalt receive thine. For Siegfried the Swift, the son of King Siegmund, is not accustomed to be in anybody's debt." Mimer was not frightened at this speech, but said, "Now I plainly perceive that thou art not so valiant as I thought thee, and as thy fathers were. So much anger about a young reptile, which thy ancestors would have trodden in the dust, or strangled without a word. I thought the creature would give thee a little pastime, for hadst thou only asked it, he would have helped thee in thy task. With the fire which spouted like a fountain from his jaws, I have burned many coals, and have roasted many a head of game, whilst thou, who thinkest thyself so wondrous bold, art afraid of it, and canst do nothing with the poor thing but kill it. I verily believe thou hast poked out its eyes when asleep, that thou mightest cut off its head without danger, like a lamb bound for the slaughter." At these words Siegfried was still more wrath, and said, laughing disdainfully, "Only stoop, thou old reptile, and my sword shall smite through thy bald head, and send thee to thy companion the dragon, that ye may amuse yourselves together, and roast and burn coals as long as you please." So saying, he grasped his sword. Mimer stepped back and said, stretching out his right hand, "Stay, and only hear me. I will offer thee amends that shall 10 times outweigh thy anger. Gold and silver thou shalt gain as none has ever done before, of all who ever wielded a sword or mounted a horse. Seest thou yonder between 2 oaks, the blue mountain with the rocky peaks? There lives my eldest brother. He watches in his cave over countless treasures, such as no king possesses. To attain them he murdered our father. Now he is accursed and crawls about in the form of a dragon. I will conduct thee to him, and will provide thee with good and trusty weapons. When we have killed him, we will share his treasures. Wait till I fetch thee the arms." So saying, he went straight into the cave, and brought a helmet, shield, and armor, the most beautiful Siegfried had ever seen. These he gave the hero, who was, however, silent, and expressed not a word of pleasure. At last the smith gave him the sword, saying, "Look ye, this is the best of all swords. I made it for Hartwit, the king in Holmgart. Take it in both hands, and stab my brother the dragon to the heart. His treasures will then be ours." Then Siegfried took the sword in both hands, raised it on high, and said, "Now I will try the sharpness of this sword, whether it be as good as thou hast said. And thy faithless heart, thou murderer of thy brother, shall feel it first." Ere the last word was off his tongue, Mimer, the false smith, lay dead at his feet. End of the 9th adventure. The 10th adventure of Siegfried the Dragon Slayer, by Anonymous. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Phil Schempf. Siegfried sees the great dragon, and meets a king of the dwarves. Siegfried now thought of pursuing his journey, but he first tore down the walls and destroyed the entire cave, where only weapons for fraud, treachery, and wickedness were forged. He left not one stone upon another, so that at the present day no one can say where stood the smithy of the giants, where Siegfried the Swift learned the art of a smith. With joyous courage he advanced through the dark woods and the green and sunny meadows. Quickly he leaped over the roaring streams in the forest, and nothing could stop his course. But the country became daily more awful and terrific. More steep and lofty were the jagged rocks. More rapidly and fiercely fell the streams. The grass and weeds in the meadows were so high that they rose far above the heads of his dogs, and beasts of prey ran about in troops. The undaunted hero proceeded onwards, till one day he heard his dogs howl mournfully. He hastened up, supposing that some venomous serpent or beast of prey had seized them, but nothing of the kind was to be seen. His dogs were standing in a meadow, the damp grass of which was reeking with the heat of the sun. On approaching near, he saw that they were howling at some foot tracks which they had discovered, the like of which he had never seen. They showed 2 large paws with long claws, and as he was inspecting them, the sun suddenly became darkened, and his dogs crept timidly up to him. He was surprised at this, for there was not a cloud in the sky. For the first time in his life he felt alarmed, when he saw a wild dragon flying over him in the air. It was black as night, but at every breath it drew, a pointed flame of fire issued from its jaws. Its head and neck were of horn, and the internal fire shone through both, with a dark red color, and lighted its blue wings. It flew slowly and steadily, making vast circles with its long tail. Siegfried now perceived to what creature the foot tracks belonged. He stood under a tree and watched the flight of the monster for a long time, and thought to himself, "May the leader of battles assist me now. Yon creature is the fiend himself in a living form, for of all the dragons depicted on my father's walls, not one is equal to this. Grant but the victory to my good sword, that I may fight a good fight against this son of darkness." Meanwhile the dragon flew quietly on, and disappeared behind a mountain. Siegfried now heard a sudden jingling of bells and the tramp of a horse. He turned round, and before him on the meadow was a tall jet-black horse, on which was seated a very little rider. Siegfried at first thought it must be a child of 3 years old, and wondered that any mother could be so careless as to let the poor infant ride about in the forest on a high horse so near the mighty dragon. But when he saw the little rider nearer, he was astonished to perceive that he had a beard whiter than snow, which reached to his girdle. His limbs and whole frame, moreover, were not formed like those of a child, but were in good proportion like those of a grown-up man. He had a venerable appearance with his long beard, and looked kindly and shrewdly from his little bright eyes. Both horse and rider were so beautifully and richly adorned that Siegfried had never seen the like in his father's castle of Königsberg. The horse's trappings were adorned in front with gold, and behind with silver, the gold inlaid with white precious stones, the silver with red, while bells of gold and silver hung on the mane, 50 on each side, giving a pleasing sound. Thrown over the horse hung a cloth of velvet, green as the grass of the meadow in spring, on which was figured the whole earth. Round it ran a sky-blue border, representing the great ocean of the world, in which swam fish of gold and silver and purple. On the green velvet were embroidered flowers of all kinds, animals and men, with pearls and diamonds, all so small and so highly adorned that a day would not suffice to examine them. The rider wore a silver helmet, on top of which shone a carbuncle bright as the morning star, while the casque itself was encircled by a golden crown. His armour was of white steel. Over it was spread a broad royal mantle, fastened at the waist by a girdle of diamonds in the form of a snake. At his side hung a small sword with a handle of rubies. Above all glanced his shield, appearing as if formed of diamonds. In the middle shone the sun, and around it the 7 stars, whilst between these ran circles of all the colours of the rainbow. The shield had this power, that when the bearer held it before him, he could see everything through it without being seen himself. Siegfried stood mute, and knew not what this strange appearance meant. "Hail to thee, valiant hero," began the little stranger. "Come hither under the trees. Thou needst not fear me. I have no ill design against thee. On the contrary, I come to offer thee fidelity and service, and my aid in every danger." "Why," said the hero, smiling, "I have no fear of thee, little man. For thy proffered friendship, however, I thank thee. Although thy help may avail but little in danger, thou couldst scarcely be seen in the high grass, and when standing by my side a stork might snap thee up, with sword and shield, taking thee for a little frog." At these words the little rider was somewhat displeased, and said, "Thou art thyself less than the giants, and yet thou thinkest to gain the victory over them. True, I am small of stature, yet I know much more than thou dost, for Siegfried the son of King Siegmund knows not my name, nor does he perhaps know my power. From gratitude I come to lead thee out of the wood, because thou hast slain the dragon who held me and my people in slavery. For know, I am named Ueglein, and I am a rich and potent king of the dwarves of these mountains. Well then, King Ueglein, answered Siegfried, show me where I can gain honour, and my sword shall ever be devoted in gratitude to thee. 'Tis well, answered the other, and had I not come hither, thy life would have been lost. For the dragon who lives hereabouts is the most fearful of all creatures, and he it is who holds captive the beautiful king's daughter of the Rhine. He took her from her father's castle, and now she sits weeping and wringing her hands on the Drachenstein. No one but myself knows the way to the spot, and she will never be released unless heaven takes pity on the poor maiden. But let us haste, or we are lost. Siegfried was delighted at hearing these words. He sprang from amid the trees, smote 3 times with his sword on a stone, which he cut asunder like a sponge, and then exclaimed, May the sword of my enemies thus pierce my body, if I depart hence till I have fought with the dragon for the maiden. If that be the case, give me leave, said the dwarf in alarm, to quit the wood and fly hence. For hadst thou traversed the whole earth from east to west, and overcome all strong men and all monsters, still must thou leave the maiden to the dragon on the rock. Nay, not so, little man. Thou must show me thy fidelity, and give me thy assistance, and help me to win her. That cannot be, replied the dwarf. If thou wilt rush upon thy death, thou must do so alone. I will no longer keep thee company. But if thou wilt follow me, I will give thee gold and pearls, and costly jewels, magic weapons, and roots of healing powers, and will teach thee likewise many a maxim of ancient wisdom, but never will I guide thee to the Drachenstein. So saying, the little man gave his horse the golden spur. But Siegfried seized the bridle, and thus in anger spoke the hero, Thou must show me the way, or thou ridest not home with thy head upon thy shoulders. Then he seized the dwarf by the beard. But the little man strove and struggled with such force that Siegfried could not sufficiently admire his prodigious strength. A magic ring gave the dwarf his supernatural power. The sweat stood upon Siegfried's forehead in great drops, but still he was unable to master his tiny opponent, and the contest lasted till in the struggle the ring fell from the dwarf's finger. Then Siegfried seized the mannikin by his right foot, threw him from the saddle, and held him head downwards against a stone, saying, On this stone I will dash out thy obstinate brains, if thou lead me not to the dragon. But the dwarf cried out piteously and said, Calm thy anger, thou proud hero. I will advise thee as well as I am able, if thou wilt only spare my life. With this Siegfried was satisfied, and set the dwarf upon his legs again. End of the 10th adventure. The 11th adventure of Siegfried the Dragon Slayer by Anonymous. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Phil Schempf. Siegfried's fight with the faithless giants under the Drachenstein. When the poor dwarf had recovered his breath, he tied his horse with fear and trembling to the trunk of a tree, and then ran on before Siegfried to the Drachenstein. He passed over wild ravines, behind waterfalls, and through the hollows of rocks, till at length he came to the entrance of a cave. It looked much like Mimer's smithy, only that it was wilder and more appalling. Here, said he, dwells Couperin, a king of the giants. When he takes his stand among the rocks and blows his horn, 1,000 giants are ready at his command, and all the dwarves in the mountains around, and all the spirits of the woods and waters are subject to him. For he is of all giants the strongest and fiercest. He with his companions can overturn mountains and pour streams over the land as he pleases. He can sink ships and root up forests. He has formed an alliance with the fierce dragon, and keeps the key which locks up the hollow cave. Hearest thou the roaring in those rocky hills, as if a mountain torrent were rushing through? That is his snoring. It is high time that we depart, for if he awakes there will be rough sport." "Nay, it is for that sport," said Siegfried, "that I have come hither." And thereupon he went to the entrance and blew the horn which hung before it, so loud that the rocks far and near re-echoed to the sound. The dwarf leaped in affright into a hollow tree, but the giant slept on. Then Siegfried blew the horn a second time, with such force that all the birds in the wood were silent and flew to their nests. But the giant never opened his eyes. He muttered only, "How loud those plaguy wasps are humming today." Siegfried now turned his spear and struck the savage sleeper in the side. Without opening his eyes, the giant struck at the spear, thinking a wasp had stung him. The iron bent in Siegfried's hand, but the monster continued his slumber. Then the hero knelt at his head and shouted with a loud voice, wake up, thou prince of giants! A young wolf is in thy nest." The monster now turned himself round and looked at the hero in scorn. Grim was his aspect, and his face was covered with red hair. His limbs were huge and clumsy, his eyes round, his mouth reached almost from ear to ear, and gaped like a mountain cave. 2 large boar's tusks stuck out, and reached up to his ill-formed nose. From his frightful appearance he bore the name of Wolfgrambear, for he was as hungry as a wolf and as savage as a bear. "What has brought thee here, boy?" he said, grinding his teeth. "I know not whether I ought to hang thee up here in my hall by the head, or thy heels, my little fellow." "Heaven forbid thou shouldst do either, thou hungry vulture," said Siegfried. "I am surely not come here to be hung. The sword is my friend, fighting my pastime, and danger my delight. So release the maiden whom thou and the dragon are keeping in captivity, or else thou shalt sink into the earth, and the oak trees shall grow over thy body." At these words the giant was in great wrath. He snatched up a rock and hurled it at the hero, but Siegfried the Swift leaped aside with a smile and avoided it. Raging with anger, the giant now raised his mighty iron poleaxe to cleave him from head to foot. But Siegfried avoided the blow, and the weapon split the rock at his feet and sank deep in the earth out of the giant's hand. As he stooped to draw it out, Siegfried sprang on him and gave him many severe cuts in his arm, while the dogs flew at him and fastened on his legs. The giant seized the dogs one after another and threw them far away into the valley. Then he seized the poleaxe anew, but the blood flowed in copious streams from many a deep wound, so that he became exhausted and fled into the middle of his cave. Here he dressed his wounds and put on a coat of mail which the dwarves had made for him, and hardened in dragon's blood. To his side he fastened a sword, broad and long, at the point of which ran a snake, and wherever it flew hissing, death entered and life departed. On his head he put a helmet of black steel in the form of a dragon. The shield which he hung around him was inlaid with iron, and so huge that he could lift upon it a knight and his horse. Thus armed, he came out with a 4-edged poleaxe, which at every stroke rang like a bell. Then he cried aloud to Siegfried, "Tell me, thou little man, what have I done to thee, that thou comest here to murder me in my sleep?" "Thou liest, savage monster! Have I not myself aroused thee to the fight, when I could have plunged my sword in thy heart?" The giant replied, "He who led thee hither has led thee to thy death, and that thou shalt find before the sun goes down behind the hills. And were there 10 such as thou art, I would put you each on a shirt you could never get off again." "Come on, then," cried Siegfried, "but take care of thyself, for many a one has boasted of doing great things when the ravens were already sitting on his helmet, ready to peck at his eyes." The two now rushed at each other and dealt such weighty blows that the fire flew from their shields, and the eagle high above the rocks and the wolf in the cave below let go their prey and fled. The giant, however, constantly missed his aim, for he was naturally clumsy and unwieldy, and his wounds had crippled him. But Siegfried struck blow after blow as rapidly as if he had had 10 swords in his hand, and hewed out pieces of the large iron shield like a carpenter at his work. Couperin at length had only the strap left in his hand. Covered with blood, he began to reel like some mighty oak, till at length he piteously exclaimed, "Hold, hold thy sword! Short as it is, it strikes deep. I have proved thy courage, and see that I cannot gain the victory over thee. Grant me but my life, brave hero. My weapons and myself thou mayest take as thine own." Then said Siegfried, "The first thing I require of thee is to free the maiden on the rock." Thus ended the strife, and both swore fidelity to each other in all their dangers. The giant that he would serve the hero faithfully, and Siegfried that he would take no revenge for the conflict. But the giant was deceitful, and all the while considered only how he could accomplish Siegfried's destruction. Siegfried, on the contrary, spoke to him frankly and kindly. "Thy wounds, my poor fellow, grieve me much. I will dress them before we ascend the rock." So saying, he tore his own garments and bound them round the wounds of the treacherous giant, and they went on their way together. Ugeline, the dwarf king, crept from his hollow tree and ran behind them, but without being seen, for he wore his cap of mist, which rendered him invisible. Siegfried went before, followed by Couperin the faithless. The way led into a narrow rocky valley. On the further side stood upon a dry, stony ground dwarf oaks and bushes. Beyond rose steep and naked rocks, half covered with trees and hollowed by falling waters. On the right descended steeply a smooth precipice of stone, and in the depth of the valley itself, foaming over rocks, rushed a wild stream. A bowshot further on, the valley was closed by another steep precipice, 100 fathoms deep, over which the stream rushed into the depth below, dashing against the rocks and masses of stone. The giant raised his hand, and pointing to a crevice in the rock above, said, "Seest thou the cave yonder behind the waterfall? There we must enter." While Siegfried was looking about, the false monster raised his hand and gave King Siegmund's son such a blow on his helmet that he fell senseless on his shield, and lay stretched on the ground like one dead. Then the giant stooped to throw him over the precipice into the foaming waters beneath, but the hero's dogs flew fiercely at him, and Ugeline, the nimble dwarf, sprang forwards, put on his cap of mist, and bore Siegfried away in safety under the trees. The giant was much surprised when he found that his enemy had disappeared. He looked round on all sides, fancying he must have fallen over the rocks from the force of the blow, and he was about to send the hounds after him. But they, accustomed to fight with wild beasts, drew back quickly when he stooped to seize them, and as he slowly rose, they sprang barking between his legs. The giant stooped again, seized one of them by the throat, and was going to throw him over the rock, when the other dog sprang upon his back and seized him by the right ear, so that Wolfgrimbeer bellowed till the valleys echoed around. Again the giant tried to seize the dog, but by this time he had come to the place where Siegfried lay with his cap of mist, and thus instead of the dog he caught hold of the dwarf's head, who immediately began to cry out piteously. Siegfried awoke from his swoon, sprang up, threw away the cap of mist, and gave the giant such a wound in the neck with his sharp sword that he instantly let go the dwarf. Then he raised his sword again to give the faithless giant his death blow, when the latter held out in his right hand a golden key and said, "Hold, or I will throw away this key, and then you will never reach the king's daughter on the Drachenstein, for in the whole world there is no key but this that will open the enchanted castle." Siegfried let fall his sword, and gave the treacherous monster his life a second time. End of the 11th adventure. The 12th Adventure of Siegfried the Dragon Slayer, by Anonymous. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Phil Schempf. of the great wonders which Siegfried saw in the Dragon's Rock. Siegfried, being aware of the treachery of the giant, now made him go on before, and so they arrived at the cave, which was concealed behind the water that fell from on high. Here they were first obliged to creep down 8 fathoms. Then the giant scraped away the earth and leaves from the ground, and a large iron lock was visible. This he unfastened, and lifting up a heavy iron plate, under which ran a stone staircase, Couperin bade Siegfried go before. But the hero looked angrily at him, and said, "Thinkest thou I have so soon forgotten thy treachery, that thou openest a new trap for me?" Then he took the large key from the lock, and pushed the giant on with it, and made him run quickly down the steps, Siegfried and the dwarf following after. They passed through long passages, which led right and left into the interior of the mountain, in which a person ignorant of the place would soon be lost, for one might wander there days and days without finding an outlet. The giant would doubtless have led the hero through byways into some abyss where he would have fallen headlong, and either have dashed out his brains against the rocks, or perished of hunger and thirst among poisonous snakes. But the giant was afraid of the dwarf, who was well acquainted with the mountain. Upon the walls Siegfried saw the blackened skeletons of various animals of frightful forms and prodigious size. The dwarf told him these were the dragons, who for centuries had lived here in alliance with the giants. Some of them still held in their claws the skeletons of those creatures that had fallen their victims. Others still stretched out their jaws, as if to vomit fire and poison. Going further, they came to a hall which was so lofty that the highest oak would not have reached the roof. In the middle of the apartment burned a dark red fire, and around it stood a circle of altars of stone stained with blood. "This is the great burial place of the giants," said Ugeline, and Siegfried saw their corpses lying in 2 rows on stone shields with stone clubs. On the altars near the fire the prisoners whom they took were slain as death offerings, and their blood was drunk at the funeral feast. They now passed through many passages, till they came to a hall which shone so bright that Siegfried was obliged to hold his shield before his eyes to prevent being dazzled. The hall looked like a vast arbour. The walls were composed of shining trees, which twined their leaves and branches close together. Fruits of silver and gold shone among the dark green foliage, and creeping plants of all kinds wound round the stems. These, however, were none of the plants which grew on the soil of the earth above, but only rare and precious metals that lie hid in the interior of the earth. The most beautiful objects of all were the flowers, which bloomed around in 1,000 varied colors. They were the precious stones that lie concealed in the mines. Elves and dwarfs, and tiny men of elegant shape and aspect, tripped nimbly to and fro, to tend the flowers, to water the trees, and to pluck the fruits. They wore garments white as the daylight, and zealously performed their duty without looking up. From this hall Siegfried entered a second, constructed of pure crystal. In the midst stood transparent pillars in 2 rows, and brilliant streams of water poured from them, forming arches of varied colors. The foot of the columns was adorned with costly shells, from which sprung up water plants, encircling the columns with their flowers. Little water sprites peeped out from the foliage, and held flowers in their mouths, from which they playfully spouted water. Beneath, in the green grass, sat sea nymphs, combing their long wet hair. Others were playing on harps, while their sisters danced in graceful movements around the pillars. So strange, yet so sweet, were the tunes to the songs that whoever heard them once could never forget them. The third hall, which succeeded this, was of blue transparent jasper. On the ceiling beamed stars of gold, and the sun and moon sat on shining horses of light and played at ball with the morning and evening stars. High above was perched a mighty eagle. When he expanded and flapped his wings, the breeze floated, now louder, now more gently through the hall, and the birds began to sing around. The giant now complained that he must rest, on account of his wounds, so they seated themselves, and while Siegfried looked around in astonishment, Ugeline, the dwarf king, said, "It may well surprise thee how a dragon can have so many splendid apartments, since his abode is the darkness of night. But thou wilt see another chamber still which outshines this as the noon excels the morning. The halls represent the elements, and for many a century thousands of industrious dwarves have labored here, and the hammer has never been out of their hands. But all this now belongs to the dragon, whom we are compelled to serve, and if thou canst not overcome him, he will kill us all with his poisonous breath, and the maiden will be irrecoverably lost. Yet it was not always so, as my forefathers have told me. There was a time when blessed spirits lived on earth in joy and unity, in dwellings of heavenly light. No sword or pointed dagger was then made, nor did the sweat of slavery run from man's brow. Vases for offerings alone came from our forges, from which pure incense rose up to heaven. Life was a pleasure, and labor sport, and on bright and shining seats sat the Osi, the fathers of mankind, and read from iron tablets the sacred maxims of eternal wisdom and the laws of the inscrutable deity, whose name none ventures to utter. But from the bosom of night rose Loki, the prince of darkness. In a form of beauty, with smiling countenance and seductive speech, the arch-deceiver appeared before the patriarch of our race, who believed his smooth words. They pledged a brotherly love to each other, and in token of amity they mingled their blood. This was the beginning of all evils. The deceived one knew not that the old dragon, the enemy of gods and men, the father of darkness, had infused into him his own poisonous breath. And there also arose from the bosom of the same night, where the fiery dragons dwell with savage giants, an evil enchantress, who was versed in all black arts. In pleasing form she appeared before our fathers, and on her forehead shone a rich ornament of gold, which she had formed by magic power from stolen rays of heavenly light. And as the fathers looked in her glowing eyes, and the dazzling brilliancy of the false gold enchained their looks, the cunning deceiver whispered to them, and avarice, envy, and discord arose in their hearts. Then all oaths and vows of fidelity were forgotten, and the first battle was fought on earth. Ever since, a fearful curse has rested on alluring magic gold, which was the cause of the evil. The Osi, when they came to their senses, would fain have destroyed in the fire the enchantress with her treacherous wealth, but thrice she rose from the flames uninjured, and laughed them to scorn. When after being pierced with the spear, she was again thrown into the flames, the crafty deceiver approached the fire, took her half-consumed heart from her bosom, and swallowed it. With the heart he became possessed of all her magic arts and power, but he had also imbibed all her wickedness, her evil desires and savage lust. Thus the flames of vice ever burned more darkly and fiercely in his bosom, and he considered only how he might destroy both heaven and earth in one vast conflagration. But the hypocrite would not cast off his dazzling appearance, for he was bent on more surely effecting the destruction of all. Now he married a giantess, a base witch, the daughter of primeval night, who continually brooded over and foretold mischief. And she produced 3 monsters, from whom all other monsters have come upon the earth. Her first child was the great serpent of the world, who, concealed at the bottom of the sea, winds his folds around the earth, holds his tail in his mouth, and swallows all that approaches him. If the water becomes too dry and shallow, he turns in raging anger, and the earth trembles at his convulsions. The second monster was the great wolf of the abyss, who is equalled by no other in savage cruelty and strength. From his nostrils he snorts forth flames. his eyes scatter fire, and he threatens to swallow up both sun and moon with his dark and voracious jaws. The third child of this pair was the princess of the lower world and of death. Shuddering awe dwells in her looks, and her empire is the dark valleys where the sun never smiles, and clouds and mists form eternal night. These three children Loki caused to be brought up among the giants in the land of night, where they grew to enormous size and strength. But he himself kept up intercourse in various forms with our forefathers, and sowed poison and destruction everywhere around. Loki once went forth with Odin and Heinar to wander over the earth. They came to a piece of water named the Waterfall of Andvari. In the stream sat an otter, catching fish and devouring them eagerly. It was not, however, a real otter, but the son of a powerful enchanter, and the brother of Mimir, the base smith, and of Fafnir, the dragon, who dwells here on the rock. Catching fish and hunting were his only pleasure, and he changed himself daily into an otter and caught fish in the stream, which he took home, where he sat in a corner and ate them. He had just snapped up a fish, when the treacherous Loki, who well knew that he was a man, caught up a stone and killed him. Loki's companions were delighted with their prey, and stripped off the skin of the otter. But it so happened that in the evening they entered the dwelling of his father, the old enchanter Hreidmar, who by the skin and by their blood-stained hands perceived at once that they had slain his son. With the help of his sons he took away their weapons, made them prisoners, and threatened to be revenged on them, unless by way of atonement they filled the skin of the otter and covered the outside of it with gold, so that not a hair could be seen. Odin and Heinar were compelled to remain with him, for they sent Loki forth to get the gold, because he was the most cunning. So he went again to the waterfall, and there made prisoner a dwarf, who kept concealed in his cave the richest treasure known to mankind. Besides an infinite quantity of gold and diamonds, there was also a miraculous helmet, the sight of which makes all living things tremble, a tarn cap, which bestows invisibility and strength upon the wearer, and the sword, Balmung, against which no shield is proof. The most precious object, however, was a gold ring of wondrous power. Whoever possessed it was sure never to want gold, for it always increased according to his wish. The ring, however, was made of false gold, which the enchantress had brought from the bosom of night for the purpose of deception, and it was the cause that oaths were first broken and blood was shed in the first battle. On it also rested the primeval curse, for it brought evil on whoever possessed it. Loki compelled the captive dwarf to bring the whole of the treasure from his cave, but the magic ring he concealed under his arm. However, Loki saw the glitter of the gold, and insisted on having the ring likewise. The dwarf begged piteously that he would leave him this one of all his treasures, but Loki was inexorable. Then the dwarf went into his cave, and uttered a fearful curse on the treasure, that it might bring no good fortune to any one, and on the ring, that it might cause the death of any one who possessed it. Loki now returned to Hreidmar, and they filled the otter's skin with the gold, placed the animal on its feet, and covered it with gold. Hreidmar examined the skin, and perceiving a single hair, required that this also should be covered with gold. Odin took the ring of discord from his finger, and while he was covering the hair with it, Loki repeated the curse of the dwarf. Hreidmar now allowed them to go their way, and from that time the treasure has been called the treasure of the Nibelungen, for Hreidmar's family was a race of night, and they were called the Nibelungen. It was not long before the splendor of the gold ring caught the eye of Fafnir, and he longed to possess it, for he was the strongest and fiercest of the brothers, and wished to call his own all that was there. He excited his brother Mimir, and they both went to their father and required their share of the recompense. Hreidmar, however, refused to give up the gold, and concealed it under his couch, that his sons might not steal it. And night and day this treasure was his anxiety and care. But the ring was never out of Fafnir's mind. In an evil hour he stole to his father's bed, drew the sword Balmung, and plunged it into the heart of his parent as he slept. When Hreidmar, the old magician, saw how his unfaithful son seized upon the gold, he repeated with his dying breath the horrible curse which he had learned from Loki, and conjured his daughters to avenge his murder. The curse of a dying father had its effect, and Fafnir was immediately changed into a fierce and fiery dragon. The flames of burning lust and the poison of consuming envy darted from his jaws, and nothing since has power to assuage his thirst of evil, for he is ever impelled to some new deed of plunder and murder. Mimir his brother required from him some portion of his inheritance of blood, and when Fafnir angrily refused him, he vowed his death. And for this reason he hath sent thee to him, and longs to drink his blood and eat his heart, for he also thirsts after this accursed gold. Loki, the crafty deceiver, who prepared this mischief, did not escape the fearful punishment of his wickedness. He committed many a ruthless act, and became more and more cruel and daring, till at last he perpetrated the most frightful deed that the human heart ever conceived. Odin, the father of the Osi, had a son whose whole countenance shone like the sun, and whose mild and gentle looks delighted everyone. Wise was his discourse, and all his sayings came to pass. Before the light which beamed from his countenance, impurity vanished, and sin fled away. Hence he was named Balder the Good, and was loved and praised by all. Now Loki, the evil one, hated no one so much as Balder the Good, and would rather have lost his own life than that he should continue to live. Evil dreams and forebodings troubled the good Balder. Fearing some dread misfortune, the Osi sent to Frigga, requesting that she would extract an oath from all and everything on earth, trees and animals, stones and diseases, poisons and snakes, that they would not injure Balder the Good, whom all so loved. All promised the goddess, and the Osi, highly delighted, placed the illustrious youth in the midst of them, and in sport threw sharp spears and pointed stones at him. Nothing injured him, for he was sacred to all things. Loki stood by and watched the sport with envious eyes. Then he assumed the form of a woman, went to Frigga, and told her with feigned delight of the sport of the Osi, and cunningly asked her if all had pledged her their oath, and if none was forgotten. Frigga said, "Eastward from Valhalla grows a mistletoe. I passed it by, for it seemed to me too tender to do any harm." When Loki heard these words, he immediately went and cut a slip from the plant for a dart. Then he returned to the sport, and went up to Höder, who stood by and took no part in the pastime, because he was blind. Loki gave the dart into his hand, and desired him to throw it in honor of the beloved Balder, and that he himself would guide his arm. Höder threw the dart, and Balder fell, pierced and dead on the ground. The Osi were struck to dumb with terror and grief, and each looked speechless at the other, for they saw in Balder's death a presage of their own destruction, and that of the whole visible world, since the curse had come upon it through the evil one whom they had received among them, and with whom they had mingled their blood. But Odin forbade them to take revenge, because the spot was dedicated to peace. With great lamentation they buried the corpse by the seaside, and all the families of mankind, even the giants from the icebergs, came to the interment. Nanna, the wife of Balder, died of a broken heart, and was buried by his side. Lastly, Odin approached the corse, and whispered in its ear. No one knows the words of farewell he uttered, but some say he spoke of a happy meeting again. Thereupon the Osi sent Hermodur, the brother of Balder, down to the pale goddess of the dead, to entreat her to restore the murdered Balder to the upper world. Hermodur rode for 9 nights to the deep valleys of the Shades, which lead to the kingdom of the dead. Then he came to a stream, and rode over a bridge which shone with gold. It was guarded by a maiden, of a bold and confident aspect, armed with sword and shield. "What wilt thou here?" she cried. "5 troops of courses rode over yesterday, and the bridge trembled not thus. Thou hast not the look of the dead. When Hermodr spoke to her of Baldur, she bade him ride further toward midnight. He came to a castle, leaped over the high gate, and stepped into the hall of the pale princess of the dead. Around her stood the maidens who accompany the dead in their journey to the tomb. Behind her stood a red cock, and at her feet lay pain, weariness, and exhaustion. There he saw Baldur and his wife, sitting on high. But the princess replied to his request, "Now I can prove whether it be true, as the report declares, that Baldur is so beloved by all. His return to the light shall be permitted, if all things alive and dead lament his death." Baldur gave his brother a miraculous ring for Odin by way of remembrance. Then they parted, and Hermodr returned. The Asi immediately sent out their messengers into the wide world to beg all creatures to release Baldur with their tears. All nature, the birds of the forest, the flowers of the meadow, and the beasts of the field, lamented the murdered one, who had been their joy and delight. As the messengers were returning home with joy, they found a hideous giantess sitting in a cave, who exclaimed, "No tears will I shed for one whose life or death troubles me not. The pale princess of the shades may keep him." The messengers at once perceived that this was no other than the base Loki, the old murderer and liar, who thus prevented the deliverance of Baldur, and they returned home sorrowful. Loki, however, urged by the fear of punishment and haunted by the thoughts of his own wickedness, flew off to a mountain, where he built a house with 4 gates, facing the 4 winds. All night he watched. In the day he changed himself into a fish, and concealed himself in a waterfall. But fearing that they would catch him there, he made himself skillfully a little net, that he might practice how to escape from its meshes. But the wicked Loki was caught in his own snare, for as he was weaving it, the Asi came. He quickly threw the net into the fire, and leaped into the water. But the Asi saw the enchanted net in the flames, and immediately made one exactly like it, as broad as the stream in which Loki had hidden himself. Then they stretched it out, and went along the stream to catch the cunning serpent. Loki swam away from the net, and concealed himself between 2 stones, so that the net passed over him. Still they could perceive that something living had touched it, so they fastened heavy balls to it, and the net then sank so close to the ground that Loki could not creep away from it. Then he swam to the mouth of the stream, and they saw him suddenly leap over it and turn back to the waterfall. So they returned back a 3rd time, divided themselves into 2 bands, and one of them, Thor the Strong, went through the middle of the stream. Loki was again driven towards the sea. He was afraid to swim into it, and leaped into the air, when, swift as lightning, Thor caught him and held him by the tail. They bore him immediately to a dark and deep cavern, and then piled up 3 stones, through which they bored a hole. A son of Loki, changed into a wolf, was there, devouring his own brother, and with the entrails of this infernal offspring they bound the father fast to the stones, for no other tie could hold him. Then a giantess, whose father he had murdered, approached and hung over him a poisonous snake, which dropped its burning venom on his face. But the Asi allowed Sigyn, his wife, to attend him in his torment. She holds a cup under the snake and catches the poison, but when she goes out to empty the cup, as it becomes filled, and the poison drops like fire upon his brow, he writhes in anguish, so that the whole earth trembles. And thus he must ever live, until that day when heaven and earth shall be destroyed. And till then the struggle will continue with his poisonous brood, the giants, enchanters, and dragons, which our ancestors the Asi commenced, and which you, the heroes, now continue. While King Uglein related this with a very serious and solemn air, the giant had leaned his head on his hands and fallen fast asleep, and it was with the greatest difficulty that Siegfried could awaken him. Then they went quickly on, and came to the 4th hall, which, as Uglein said, surpassed the others in miraculous splendor. Around the walls burnt fire. White flames and blue, and red and green, wound round in figures of varied kinds, flowers and birds and beasts. Then suddenly 1,000 sparks shot forth and transformed themselves in the air into shining stars, golden crowns, and wreaths of flowers. In the middle of the hall was a basin with a golden rim, from the midst of which grew an ash tree that reached to the ceiling. The ground in which it stood was crystal clear, so that all its roots could be seen as if it stood mirrored in a lake. Siegfried could not sufficiently admire this tree, which the dwarfs had so skilfully made. Green leaves and golden fruits adorned the widespread boughs and dropped their dews of honeyed sweetness. Above, on the summit, sat a royal eagle, with a bright and piercing glance, and spread out his broad wings. On his head stood a hawk. Below on the ground were standing, on the 4 sides, 4 stags, which stretched out their necks upwards and ate the leaves of the tree. 3 roots ran from it into the crystal basin. The middle root went deep into the abyss below. There lay an enormous dragon, enveloped in darkness, swelling with poison and gnawing incessantly at the root. Around him crawled 1,000 poisonous serpents and hungry wolves, and a dark vapor ascended from the pit. In the midst of it was a seat on which sat a female, with a crown on her head, a pallid countenance, and with a dark dress. Behind her on the back of the seat stood a large flame-colored cock, at whose feet grazed a raven-black horse near a rushing stream. The second route ran from the ash towards the north. There masses of ice lay piled up on each other, and therein sat great giants around an enormous horn, from which issued a spring. Opposite to this route ran a third, which was surrounded with light, and from a spring near it came forth sky-blue water. 2 white swans were swimming in the water, and 3 beaming maidens stood on the margin, and took up water in golden vessels and sprinkled the tree. Around the spring were placed 12 royal seats or thrones, upon which sat princes and princesses with golden crowns. A squirrel ran nimbly up and down the trunk, from the eagle on the top to the serpent below. Siegfried looked at all this with amazement, and asked the dwarf what was the meaning of the tree. "That," replied the wise king, "is the celebrated ash tree Yggdrasil, an image of the world. The leaves of the tree are the clouds, and the golden fruits are the stars of heaven. The eagle that floats above is the king of heaven, who with searching eye overlooks the world. The stem is the earth, and thence a root goes down into the depths below, where sits the princess of the lower world. Near her grazes the horse, who brings to her the dead from life, and behind her sits the red cock. When the cock begins to crow, the world is destroyed. The dragon that vomits flames and the serpents are the subterranean fire and fierce storms which agitate earth and sea, and the wild desires and passions which disturb the breast of man and undermine his life, and gnaw continually until the tree is destroyed. The beautiful fountain with the golden seats, near the second root to the right, is the south portion of the world. The 3 maidens are the 3 fates, who spin the thread of life. The 2 swans of light are the sun and moon, and around shine the princes of heaven with their crowns. The root on the left is the north portion of the earth. There stands the lofty icebergs. There rises the sea, and there lies the great horn, from which, at the last day, when the 6 winters of the world have passed away, the summons to the last judgment will be sounded. Its call will summon all, from the highest heaven above to the deepest abyss below. The leaves of the tree will tremble with fear, and its boughs will shake, and the earth will be convulsed, and the sea will roar. Then all ties will be loosened and torn asunder. The serpent of the world will rise with giant fury out of the water. The wolf will spring howling from the abyss, and open wide its jaws at heaven. The dwarfs will sigh at the gates of rock. Fires will rage around the tree of the world. The sun and moon will be swallowed up by the wolves of darkness, and the stars will fall from the sky. The day will be turned into night, and Loki will appear with all his evil spirits from hell, and the heroes will contend with him in the last great contest of the world. The deity, who first created all things and sent light into the world, will consume the corrupted earth with his purifying fire. When, however, the last battle has been fought, when the dying heroes shall have conquered the powers of darkness, and the flames have consumed the world, then a new morning will dawn in the heavens. A new and more happy earth will arise. The seeds will grow up of themselves, and sparkling waterfalls will gush forth over the smiling verdure of the meadows. Then the good will receive their reward, and will again become possessed of the brazen tablets of eternal wisdom, which they lost in the beginning of time. But the bad, the perjurers, murderers, and deceivers, will wade in streams of poison on the strand of corpses in the hall of serpents, and the old dragon with his brood will fall into the abyss. End of the 12th adventure.
Let's take a small break here. Let's put some music on. 30 minutes left on this. Fun. What happened to my audiobook here?
The 13th Adventure of Siegfried the Dragon Slayer by Anonymous. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Phil Schempf. How Siegfried first sees the king's daughter and is received by her. Thus speaking, they entered a lofty chamber by an iron door. Around on the walls hung in double rows helmets and shields, and between them, in wild disorder, splendid garments embroidered with gold, drinking horns ornamented with silver and silken banners. But all looked desolate and waste. The garments were stained with blood, the helmets and shields were rusted. Over the drinking horns large spiders had woven their nets, and the silken banners were yellow with smoke. By the general disorder it might easily be seen that it was all the produce of pillage. But the most fearful objects that met the eye in this robber's den of the dragon were black iron pillars which ran through the hall. Around them were fastened horns of the deer and the aurochs, and on every point of these horns was stuck a naked skull. Siegfried, sword in hand, glanced around the apartment, but neither the dragon nor the maiden were to be seen. It now appeared as if his ear caught the sounds of music not far from him. He went in the direction in which it came, and looked through a high vaulted gallery on the distant landscape. At the end of this passage he saw a maiden seated on a rock with a harp in her hand. She looked down into the wooded valleys, and sang and played, whilst a falcon sat upon her harp, as if listening to her. Siegfried stood still with his companions, and hearkened as she sang thus. My father sat within his hall, and drank the red and cooling wine. He drank from out a cup of gold, at Worms, upon the dark green Rhine. My mother held the silken threads within her hand so lily white, and worked upon the cloth of gold the deeds of hero and of knight. My brothers threw the dice in sport, for swords and arms enriched with gold, the while I sat within and sang the deeds of knight or hero bold. But swift descending from above, a dragon fierce was seen to glide. He twined his folds around my form, and said, Come hence and be my bride. My father dropped his cup of gold, my mother wrang her hand so white. My brothers drew their swords in vain, the dragon bore me from their sight. And long may I here sit and sing my lay upon the Drachenstein. My song will never reach, dear friends, to you upon the dark green Rhine. And long may I lament in vain, yon valley lies so far, so deep. I never can my woes explain. Oh, would I in the grave could sleep. The singer ceased, interrupted by her tears. But she quickly and more vigorously seized the strings and renewed her song. Yet, Fay, art thou a captive, for ever doomed to be? What hinders thee to venture to be free? One effort still may save thee, then why delay so long? Are fear and fright such fetters? Is the dread of death so strong? O no, the Father's Spirit still liveth in the heart. It shrinketh not from danger, nor dreads from life to part. O then sound my harp strings, and echo my lay. Ye both shall attend on my dangerous way, for hence I would flee and find myself free. Then take me, ye breezes, and raise me above, and waft me away to the region I love, where spring's soft bowers are filled with flowers. Nor leave me to wander uncertain my flight, but grant me the blessing of light. Hence let me flee, from dragon's haunt free. When she had ended her song, she turned to the abyss, But at this moment Siegfried sprang towards her and held her back. "Stay, thou noble daughter of a king," he cried. "Here stands Siegfried, the son of King Siegmund, who will die or plunge the dragon into this abyss. Cease therefore from weeping. Thy sorrow shall be changed to joy, and the dragon shall crouch in the dust before thee, and shall atone for thy tears with his heart's blood. Thanks, valiant hero, for thy aid, but haste away from hence. Thou canst not save me, but wilt only perish here, and thus increase my grief." "No," replied Siegfried, "here I will fight for thee, for otherwise shame would strike me to the heart, which is sharper than iron itself. When a child, I made a vow never to turn my back upon fire or sword." "Thou knowest not what thy tongue utters," answered the maiden. "'Tis madness to contend with that horrid creature. Wilt thou place thyself on the very spot where the lightning strikes? No sword can pierce his scales, and steel itself melts before his flaming breath. Return and bear to my parents and brothers my last farewell." "Nay, lady, unworthy were I to be called the son of King Siegmund, nor could I ever dare to look my noble ancestors in the face and fight as they did the great battle of the world, were I to flee like a coward. Never has fear stained the honor of our race, and when once my sword gleams in my hand, victory or death can alone return it to its scabbard." "Alas," interrupted the dwarf, "thy sword can little help thee. One sword alone, Balmung, the sword of the Nibelungen, with which Fafnir slew his father, has the power of giving the dragon his death wound. For this reason he keeps it concealed, and if the maiden cannot reveal to us this secret, all conflict is vain." The king's daughter said that she had never heard of this sword. "Then much I fear," said the dwarf gloomily, "that our death is not far distant, for never wilt thou slay the dragon with the sword thou bearest, and of this I will give thee a proof." Thereupon he sprang suddenly into the hall, and returned with a large and ancient shield, which he could only just drag after him. "As vainly may your sword attempt to cut the dragon's skin that is stretched over this shield, as to wound the dragon himself." Then Siegfried swung his sword above his head with both hands, and dealt so powerful a blow that it resounded through all the halls of the hollow mountain. But the shield remained uninjured, and the sword broke off at the handle. At the sight of this all were lost in amazement. The dwarf wrung his hands, and the maiden entreated Siegfried to fly. But the hero was still undaunted. He yielded not a step, and said, "To the brave man, courage is more than a good sword, and my courage at least is yet unbroken. My arms are still strong, and with them I will slay the dragon. For to the just heaven will give strength and victory." "As thou art a bold hero," said the giant, who had hitherto kept silence, "and thy magnanimity has granted me my life, thou shalt now reap the fruit of my services in return. I once slept near the dragon. He had just had a hard battle, and threw himself down to sleep, when in a dream he exclaimed, 'Ho, ho! They cannot kill me yet, for they know not that the sword lies hid in yon corner.' I sought for the sword in that corner, and found it. Only lift yon stone, and you will see a ring, beneath which it lies." Siegfried, overjoyed, hastened to the spot, removed the stone, raised the ring with both his hands, and beneath it, like a bright flame, lay the glittering dragon's sword. He stooped to lift it up, but the faithless giant took his dagger and aimed a blow at Siegfried's neck, at the spot where the linden leaf had fallen. But just as he was succeeding in inflicting the wound, Euglein struck the giant with his ring so violently on the knee that he staggered, and the edge of the dagger glided off. But the giant now seized the hero, and clasping him with both arms from behind, dragged him to the abyss, in spite of the furious attacks of the dogs. The king's daughter fell weeping on her knees, wrung her hands, and prayed to heaven, while the giant laughed aloud, as if certain of victory. Siegfried, however, twined his arms around the body of the false monster, and pressed so strongly into his wounds that all his strength passed away, and the giant lost both sight and hearing. His black blood flowed in broad streams. He roared and cursed himself and the hero, on whom he still kept a firm hold, with his last strength to pull him into the abyss with himself. But it was all in vain. Siegfried loosened himself from his grasp, and at length pushed him into the chasm. With a hollow sound he fell into the mighty depth below, and as he fell he broke asunder an enormous oak which covered his corpse. End of the 13th adventure. The Last Adventure of Siegfried the Dragon Slayer, by Anonymous. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Phil Schempf. Siegfried's Fight with the Dragon. Siegfried was now desirous to try the sharpness of his sword, and it glided through the dragon's shield like water, and went deep into the rock. All were full of joy when they saw this, but the wise dwarf alone looked grave and said, "Thou hast a harder battle still to fight, and thou requirest meat and drink to refresh thee for it." Then he blew his little silver horn, and at its shrill sound there came forth from the crevices of the rocks dwarfs, white and grey. Then they spread a carpet and brought meat and drink of all kinds, and Siegfried sat down and ate. And the maiden offered him a golden drinking horn, saying, "Hail to the hero of the Netherlands! Hail to the bold son of Siegmund! Hail to the fighter with the dragon, Siegfried!" The hero drained the cup and said, "Truly never did I feel so inspired with courage, and never longed for the chase of the boar in my father's forests, as I now do for the contest with this hideous dragon, the keeper of the treasure of the Nibelungen. If my forefathers stood here in a circle, as they stand around the walls of our halls at home, they would indeed rejoice in the contest, for the sound of my sword shall re-echo far around, and gladden the heart of many a hero. Come what may, I dread none on earth, and I stand here on this stone, armed and prepared, with this uplifted sword to meet the fight." As he spoke thus, a roaring sound was heard, which vibrated nearer and nearer, as if the mountain were shaken and falling into ruins. Thereupon the maiden was struck with great terror, but the eyes of Siegfried glanced like two flaming swords, and he bade her be of good cheer, saying, "The author of light gave us life, and how shall the dragon of darkness take it away? My sharp and gleaming sword shall dazzle him so that he shall not be able to distinguish the day from the night." As the evening twilight arose, the dragon came slowly onwards, hovering like a dark storm cloud. Siegfried advanced and met him on the edge of the rock. Near him stood his two faithful dogs. The maiden drew back, and the dwarf put on his cap of mist and crept into a crevice of the rock. 3 times did the dragon fly searching around the stone, for as yet he had not seen the hero. But just as he was about to lie down, he perceived Siegfried, and sending forth furiously blue flames, he lashed the earth with his tail. In a moment the hero's shield was covered with blue flame, and became glowing hot. His dogs were about to fly at the monster, but they fell dead to the earth at his first breath. The poisonous flames darted more and more fearfully on Siegfried, and to cool himself he was forced to withdraw into the vaulted gallery of the mountain. Thither the dragon could not follow him, for the passage was too narrow, so he remained spouting forth fire at the entrance, and knew not how to get in. Nor did Siegfried know how he should reach the dragon with his good sword. In this difficulty he looked around and saw lying near him a huge stone, which 10 men could not have lifted. Remembering his great ancestors, he seized it and threw it in the gaping throat of the pestiferous monster. And now the flames being quenched, he darted with sword and shield upon the dragon, and dealt him blow after blow upon the head. But the blows of Siegfried's sword at first produced no effect. The scales were hard as diamonds, and the sword flew back. On a sudden, as he was striking with all his might, he heard a plaintive tone, which seemed like the voice of the dwarf, as if calling for help from the dragon's jaws. And so it was, for the dwarf had seated himself under his invisible cap of mist, upon the stone which Siegfried had thrown into the dragon's mouth, and now he called out in terror, lest Siegfried should kill him. When the dragon heard the cry of the invisible dwarf, he turned round, but at that moment Siegfried dealt him with a heavy blow on his neck, at the point where the scales were a little parted. The sword struck into the neck, and the pent-up flames burst through the wound at the side, so that Siegfried was now safe from them. The little dwarf crept quickly out of the wound. The dragon raved still more with the pain. He fell on Siegfried, snatched his shield, and snapping it like a lath, he flew at the hero's head. But Siegfried too was now fired with rage, and grasping his sword firmly, struck off the monster's right claw. Thereupon the dragon roared with fury, swung his tail around, and strove to entwine the hero in its folds. But Siegfried at a bound leaped high above the tail, and now ran with such force against the monster that he threw him backward on the ground. Then seizing his sword with both hands, with the first blow he drove it 2 spans deep into his breast. At the second he cut his heart through and through, so that the sword sank deep into the stone. And as he was about to give a third blow, he himself fell senseless beside the monster, which in the death struggle was consumed in its own fire. Such was the great fight with the black poisonous dragon, who guarded the treasure of the ancient curse, by which the hero of the Low Countries acquired fame and glory above that of all his fathers. The deeds he wrought with his sharp sword at the Drachenstein have resounded for centuries from north to south in many a heroic lay by the ancient minstrels, nor can the name of Siegfried the Dragon Slayer ever pass away as long as German song is sung. Pale as death laid the exhausted hero for a long time. Then he fetched a deep breath and slowly opened his eyes. But how great was his sorrow when he saw lying near him the king's daughter, pale and motionless as a corpse. He sprang up, took her in his arms, called on her by name, but she awoke not, nor gave any signs of life. The hero began to lament aloud his misfortune, when at length Uglein the dwarf came stealing by. He looked about on all sides, and was overjoyed when he saw that Siegfried had slain the dragon. He immediately went to the Virgin, took a root from his girdle, and with its scent awoke her to new life. The joy of Siegfried was only equalled by that of the beautiful daughter of the Rhine king. And Uglein too was so delighted at their deliverance from the dragon that he begged the hero to claim from him whatever he liked, gold or diamonds, costly ornament or weapons, for all were at his command. Siegfried thanked him for his offer, but said that his deliverance of the maiden was reward enough for him. If, however, he desired to do him a favour, he would ask him, who was so well informed of the future, to tell him his destiny. The dwarf immediately placed his bright gleaming shield on a table of stone, and held a handful of dry grass to the sun, which forthwith burst into flame. Then he threw a precious perfume over the shield. A singular odour diffused itself around, but the dwarf inhaled the vapour, his eyes closed, and turning a costly ring on his finger, began, as if in a deep slumber, to pronounce the following invocation. As the falcon in its motion flies in circles round and round, seeking both o'er land and ocean where its prey may best be found, so the venerable sage, turning still his magic ring, sees through many a coming age, many a dim and distant thing. On this he ceased a while, then pointed with his finger to the south, then to the right and left, as if forms surrounded him on every side, and then announced the marriage of Siegfried with Kriemhilde thus: Rosy gardens on the Rhine, meadows full of bright sunshine, through which wander streamlets fair, stags and roebucks, pair and pair, foliage with the feathered throng warbling wild the woods among, while a silken thread encloses all this fairy bower of roses. Many a knight with martial tramp watches round the forest camp. From the branches, from the trees, pennons wanton in the breeze. Round the throne so fair to see, all of gold and ivory. Ladies look on scenes so fair, brave knights look on ladies there. One his proud compeers outvies, like the sun in yonder skies. Like the moon in modest pride, one sweet maiden is his bride. For to her that hero youth gives a ring in pledge of truth. All the maidens softly sigh, all the youthful heroes cry, Hail to Siegfried and his prize! This, oh this is paradise! But an evil dame is nigh, malice in her heart nigh, and she brings the bride so fair 3 young rosebuds, sweet and rare. Take the purest of the 3. Take, she cries, 'tis meant for thee. But beware, sweet bride, beware, for a thorn is lurking there. See it wounds thy finger fair. Bride, why stops thy sobbing breath? Bride, why art thou pale as death? The dwarf was silent for a while, and then turning towards the west, began to sing thus of Siegfried's death. Hunter's horn and hunter's song, wolves and bears together throng. Through the wild wood runs the boar, hounds that follow bark and roar. Foxes creep in corners sly, birds are twittering in the sky. 2 white does in flight are seen, and a stag in clover green. Hark, a sound of hunter's horn, by the breezes hither borne. Through the deep wood's dark defiles, where the sunbeam never smiles. Hark, 3 dismal ravens croak on a dry and withered oak, and their dark foreboding song tells a tale of death and wrong. And the streamlet's gentle flood flows with warm and vital blood. Stretched upon the flowery heath, see, a hero sleeps in death. Howling wild his faithful hound licks in vain his deadly wound, while his falcon from his breast drives the ravens to their nest. See his stainless sword and shield lie unused upon the field. He hath never seen his foe, treachery laid the hero low. In his halls 2 women fair sit in fierce defiance there, frowning darkly each at each, deigning not a word of speech. Hastening from the neighboring wood come 2 knights all stained with blood. Of the women one is glad, but the other pale and sad. One has drained a cup of gold, sinks the other pale and cold. One the thought of rage inspires, but revenge the other fires. Finally the dwarf turned towards the north and sang with a hollow voice the revenge of Kriemhilde. Heroes feast within a palace, guests all wear a festive wreath, but their mirth is changed to malice, and their dance to a dance of death. Shrieks of horror, shrieks of anger, tell the fury of their strife. Answering fierce the trumpet's clangor, stern demanding life for life. Sword and shield in strife are meeting, steel and iron sternly strive. And of the guests that late were greeting, few shall quit the spot alive. In that hall of strife and treason, many a bravest knight must yield. Like the sheaves in harvest season, corses strew the fatal field. But in death their hate is banished, foemen fall beside their foe. And their hatred hath but vanished, now that death hath laid them low. Wandering where the dead are lying, say what mystic form appears. Mid the wounded and the dying, 'tis a woman bathed in tears. Fire has seized the hall around her, while its vapors choke her breath. She exclaims, while flames surround her, we have died for Siegfried's death. Thus sang the dwarf of the fate of future days. Siegfried and the maiden were deeply affected by the serious tone of his song. Although they had not understood all that he said, yet they perceived that bleeding forms looked through the mist that surrounded the whole, and that these were lighted rather by fierce and fatal lightning than by the gentle rays of sunshine and peace. When the dwarf had ended, he took his leave, saying that he must descend deep into the mountain, whither his dwarfs had fled, anxious for the result of the contest. for he would bring them the glad intelligence of victory. Then he bade the hero farewell, and promised, if he should require his aid, to assist him with all his power and all his wealth, adding that he would find 2 horses ready for mounting at the mouth of the cave. Siegfried thanked him, and the dwarf disappeared in a crevice of the rock. The hero and the king's daughter rested for a while on the summit of the Drachenstein, and looked at the far distance over the lofty wooded tops of the mountains, over the green plains and vales, the barren heaths and silver streams. Then they examined everything in the cave, and came to the dragon's couch, which he had made of the skins of lions. Siegfried lifted up the skins, and a dazzling light burst upon his sight, and the treasure and the ring lay before him. But he forgot the warning voice of the dwarf concerning the ancient curse which lay on the gold of the Nibelungen. He took the treasure of discord and envy, and hence, at a later period, the words of Ugeline came to be fulfilled, and he and his whole race were annihilated by fire and sword, like those who had possessed it before. The treasure, however, was cast into the Rhine, where it may rest until a holy hand shall find it, over which the curse has no power. Here, however, ends this tradition, and its sequel has been said and sung in other songs and legends, in which, reader, thou mayest hear how Siegfried celebrated in the rose garden of Worms his marriage with Kriemhilda, how he gloriously contended in 7 conflicts, winning heroic fame, and how he was slain in the forest by the cruel Hagen at the instigation of Brunhilde, but was fatally avenged by Kriemhilde on the giants, their brothers and relations. But the good town of Worms, where Siegfried celebrated his marriage, and where he was treacherously slain, honored his memory by a praiseworthy custom for centuries after, out of gratitude for its deliverance from the cruel dragon. When a minstrel sang his deeds publicly before all the people in such a manner that the judges appointed could find no fault, a piece of gold was awarded him by the council of the city. In our poor times this ancient custom no longer exists, but in former days the city caused the figures of Siegfried and the ancient race of kings to be painted in different places, at the council house, at the Mainz gate, at the new tower, and at the mint, where the bones of the dragon hung in chains of iron. Siegfried's spear was preserved, and the rose garden is still shown. And when, in 1488, the Emperor Frederick III was at Worms, he ordered the bones of the hero to be sought for in the churchyard, but nothing was discovered. Certain it is, however, that up to the present day the armorial bearing of Worms is the giant's key, which locked up the stone, and the supporter, the fiery dragon whom Siegfried slew, and that his memory lives in the songs of many a minstrel and in the hearts of the people. End of the last adventure. End of the heroic life and exploits of Siegfried the Dragon Slayer, by Anonymous.
All right. That was good. And I think we are so close to done that we can call it. I might return on just a little bit, but yeah, hopefully dropping soon. Thanks for watching, and we'll do something else next time.